Greetings, my brothers and sisters. Sending gratitude to all of you who are joining in today to accompany us down the rabbit hole of self-exploration through plant medicines. My name is Ryan Sprague, and I'm here to tell you that your frequency is now set and tuned to explore psychedelic medicines and the impact they've made among the countless psychonauts exploring the last true frontier. Buy a ticket and take the ride with me as we get true first-hand accounts of the experiences, benefits, risks, and transformations taking place within the ever-expanding world of psychedelic medicines on This One Time on Psychedelics. Shadow work is a term that I imagine any of you listening to this episode can recall hearing, especially in recent times. The idea of parts of us that are left in the shadows, waiting to be reclaimed into the wholeness of our being, has been talked about throughout antiquity in various different manners, and has been called many different things. Yet the idea that these aspects of us exist and are holding within them valuable lessons that, when learned, can help us open up new aspects of our lives and ultimately find more fulfillment is something most spiritual practices believe in one way, shape, or form. Coming back onto the show to dive into the rabbit hole with us about shadow work today is a gentleman who, since I first met, has quickly become a close brother of mine. And whether it's our Breathe with Cannabis events, our long list of mutual passions, or deep dives such as this one, we always have an amazing time together. This episode was filmed live when him and I were on a recent trip out west to do some workshops, and we decided one night at around 8:30 p.m. to riff on the topic of shadow work, and this is what came out. We hope you guys enjoyed as much as we did making it, and as such, sit back, enjoy the ride, and give me a big hand in welcoming my man Christopher August back to the show. Chris, my man, pleasure to have you back on the show, brother. So excited to have you here.
It's amazing to be here and to be traveling with you the past, week now. We've been in Cali. Now we're in Arizona, chilling out. And It's really, as we were just talking about off air, like, it's so nourishing to be around genuine soul people that are just like down to have a good time, but also dedicated to their growth, dedicated to helping others and supporting others. And, you know, I've been reflecting a lot lately, just ever since you came in my life and some other people that I've just, been collaborating with. It's just so nice to be around that energy. And
dude,
here we are, brother.
100%, man. I was just saying before we hit record, I say a lot of good things before I hit record. We were like having some great conversations, but I was saying that the other night at our workshop, we hosted a Breathe with Cannabis workshop the other night live in LA. And, I was looking around at the people that came, and I remember I was leaving and I was just like, guys, if this is what we're vibrating to, we're doing really good, and it's such a good sign because, again, if your vibe does attract your tribe, right? AKA the law of resonance, right? Mm-hmm. So if what vibrates at the same level attracts one another, you can look around at the people in your life, the places, the things, the events, everything that's happening, and really get a good gauge overall, kind of like, a cooking approach to like, all right, things seem to be going pretty well, right? If challenging things starts happening, it allows you to be able to go, okay, maybe I need to look within. And speaking of looking within, today we're going to be talking about shadow work. And, guys, I really wanted to do this on the podcast because I feel this term is thrown around a lot and for really good reason, right? But I imagine for a lot of you, very similar to me, like I learned little bits from different people. And so it was hard to piece it all together into one unified approach. And so I was really excited to get you on to do shadow work because you work a lot in this realm. And, so I wanted to start out by just asking blatantly, what is shadow work? How do you define shadow work?
Yeah. And I think right now is like such an important time to be talking about this because number one, I think everybody, whether they claim to be intuitive or not, people can feel this sort of looming darkness in a way that is, really wanting to be seen. And collectively, and then also personally within ourselves, a lot of people that come to me, a lot of people I work with, people say, something feels off, or someone's aware enough to tap deeper into their emotional landscape, so what's going on in there, all of that. But I think we can all feel this sort of collective upheaval of the shadow. And so what is the shadow? Carl Jung coined this term, who is a famous psychotherapist, as you know, and he's been influential in my work, I know with you as well. And the shadow, what is it? It is basically all of the parts of yourself that have been repressed and suppressed, all the parts that you deem as unlovable, unworthy, all of those things that maybe you see in others and perhaps you judge, that's all within you as well. And when we are separated from that, we are not actually in our wholeness. You know, a lot of times in the spiritual community, as we've also talked about, everything is all about love, right? And light and all of that. And yes, our essence is love. But we also need to look at both sides of ourselves. We need to look at the darkness because the darkness is the gateway to the light. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really, really stoked to be diving into this subject today. Yeah. And I'd love for you to add anything into that as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's funny because like when I think about the shadow, I think about exactly like you said, these repressed parts of us that a lot of times, guys, like it's not that we consciously think about these things. Like I'll probably go into a personal thing that happened for me recently with my shadow to show you like how this actually can operate behind the scenes, right? Because you don't know what you don't know until you know it, right? So for most of us, we're adults now. We're starting to come into this like, you know, awareness. Maybe we're interacting with psychedelics. Of course, we're listening to this podcast. We're meditating. We're doing breath work, et cetera. And this is increasing the ability of consciousness to expand within us. And you mentioned love and light, right? And I think a lot of people get this misconstrued because they think love and light, it sounds like all love, right? Like those two words are kind of synonymous. But that's actually a yin and yang, right? Love being the yin, light being the yang. And light, right? Like what is light? Light, we might think of it as this amazing thing because it is, right? But also, what happens when light turns on in the dark place? You start noticing all the cobwebs and all the things that are dirty in there. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of the time what light does, right? And so like psychedelics, all of these things, they have the ability to bring more light to you. But that can be a very big upheavaling process because if you see all these parts of you that you didn't know were you, and like you were saying, you were probably judging other people, it can kickstart an identity crisis, a dark night of the soul, all these things, which are extremely positive in the long run. But if people aren't properly set up to know what's happening and how to deal with it, it can be an ordeal rather than an experience.
100%. And we haven't been actually taught on how to work with these parts of ourselves, mainly because we're so disconnected from ourselves to begin with, our feelings and our emotions, which is the gateway to our inner worlds and into our somatic body, which we can also talk about the power of somatic experiencing, somatic healing as it relates to shadow work and all of that. But another point to make, which I think is super important, is that all of our shadow exists within the unconscious, right? And so what drives our reality? Well, our unconscious and subconscious drive our everyday reality. And most people are operating on autopilot. And so all of the experiences that they're having, the relationships they have, the people they meet, all of the things happening in their life is all happening from this place of the unconscious. And so people then wonder, why am I experiencing all these challenges, all of this pain and all of these things? Well, there's been parts of ourselves that, again, have been repressed, rejected, suppressed, whatever, that we need to look at in order to change our reality. And we talked about in the beginning, your vibe attracts your tribe. Your inner world is the most important world to start with, because the outer world, the external reality you perceive around you, is a reflection of that.
Exactly.
And so when we're going into our inner world, and why this is the most important work, and I'll say it over and over and over again, if you want to have a better, more thriving, vibrant life overall, start with yourself. Look within. That's where it starts. And this is why shadow work is key.
Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to take a quick moment to let you all know that the doors are officially open for the Conscious Cannabis Collective. And as such, this is the last week you can sign up and receive all of the bonuses we're currently including. This is the last time I will be personally onboarding those of you who sign up with a complimentary one-on-one session, and you'll have the ability to get the Grow with Cannabis course for free during this limited time. For more info on how you can take advantage of this offer, head down to the show notes for this episode and secure your spot today, as we only have so many spots left and they are filling up quickly. Now back to the show. Absolutely. And, it's funny because what came to me during that is that, I think a lot of us, myself included for a long time, thought that by getting massages and doing all the things that are very important, I would start just by automatic function resolving my trauma, right? Or my shadow or any of these things. And what I realized is that, like, why would I expect that when to get muscles, you need to go to the gym, you need to go through something that's challenging. If you want to do an ice bath and get the benefits of that, you got to sit through an ice bath. Sauna, the same thing. Yoga, the same thing. Even eating healthier means cooking at home, taking more time, right? Like, most things that are worth it are not exactly easy, but that's actually what makes them worth it, because the more that you actually can conquer things, right? And like, start something, make a goal, start something and finish it, the more confidence you get, right? And the more faith you have in yourself to handle whatever comes up. And it's important because the shadow is more than likely never going to come up the way that you think it will come up. It's going to come up in a way that will ultimately challenge you. And so if you're aware of how to keep your autonomic functions in check, if you're aware of how to take care of yourself, you're emotionally aware enough to know when to say no and when to say yes and what's in alignment, it's going to make that part of the journey that much easier, right? Or that much simpler, I'll say, right? Not easier necessarily, but simpler.
Yes. And, I think another important point also to piggyback off that is this idea, right? That how do we see the shadow? Like, someone hearing this for the first time. Okay, we explained a little bit about shadow work. So how do I recognize the shadow? And one of the best things that we can, use as that barometer is our triggers. Where we are triggered, that's generally where the shadow lies. And so also with different modalities and things like that. Now we can get into psychedelics a little bit. We can get into obviously just our everyday external reality, whatever triggers us. But also when we start to tap into the subtle reality, especially through psychedelics, through breath work, through these peak experiences, we begin to see where those triggers actually lie within us and then within our bodies. And that's a huge thing to start actually tapping into and then understanding your shadow.
Absolutely. I mean, the somatics are huge. And one of the things I want to say too is that I definitely don't want to paint the shadow, in my own words, as if it's all doom and gloom, because
I agree.
Not only does it hold your greatest lessons, but there's also like this concept of what's called the golden shadow.
Yep.
And this is the idea that, like, I know for me personally, maybe some people listening, I'm sure you would agree, you've had your experiences like this, but I would see people doing awesome stuff. Like, I'm a musician, right? So I go see like amazing guitar players, let's say, right? And there'd be a part of me that gets super triggered, right? Like, I wouldn't be able to fully enjoy the music. And I never really knew what it was when I was younger. And then I realized, like, oh, it's because I know, like, that matters to me. Like, being a guitar player and sharing my music matters to me. I know that. And therefore, I took some time away from guitar, right? Where I was kind of out of alignment, let's just say, right? I'm kind of stagnant with the style of music I was playing. What I realized was that witnessing that person on stage was like me knowing I could be doing that, but I was giving myself shitty stories as to why I wasn't. And there was a part of me that was like, that's not good enough. You can't just give shitty stories. We're not going to make you feel okay about this. And so the more that I fell into my own insecurities about, like, what if people don't like the way I play, all these kind of things, the more that part of me, right, soul, whatever you want to call it, source of infinite wisdom, allowed me to see with challenging feelings that there was something out of alignment, right? Pain is a teacher, so like those uncomfortable feelings or any of these types of things, they present a response called pain that, makes us aware that, hey, something's going on, right? And it took me a long time to realize that pain was not the enemy. It was actually refusing to acknowledge the pain that became the enemy. And so it's, when we get into somatics and these types of things, like, I know you're really big in this, and, we've all probably heard the saying, the issues are stored in the tissues. Like, how would you describe somatics to people? Because I feel like this connection between shadow work and somatics is something that's so amazing and such a great utility to be able to walk away from this episode knowing how to do, because this stuff is simple. Again, doesn't mean it's easy. The process can be challenging, but like tuning into our bodies, like, there's a reason we're created like this, because we're meant to do this for ourselves, So I'd love if you could speak to that and like the kind of ability to heal ourselves from this.
Absolutely. And it's a perfect segue into this, because the body is the infinite source of wisdom. The body is the intelligent vessel, right? And within our bodies houses all wisdom, all memories of everything. It's a living library. And when we can actually tap into our body through different modalities, as we spoke to, and we'll get into in a little bit, we can really begin to explore and to understand where we feel things. And that's the first and most important step. where do you feel it? So somatic, where does that word come from? That's a Greek term. Well, soma is a Greek term for the body. And so when we talk about somatics, we are strictly talking about the body and accessing the body through these different tools. And so, like I said, the first step is to feel. And when we begin to feel, you can even ask yourself a question. If there's a fear that comes up, I'll outline the process that I take people through. Where do you feel that fear? We'll just take fear, for example. Where do you feel this fear coming up? Or where do you feel this trigger? Okay, if I close my eyes, I tune in, I take a few deep breaths, you can probably tell me right off the bat where fear shows up for you. So for me, it generally shows up in my solar plexus. So I know there is some energy that has been stored there that needs attention. It needs my attention to look at. Okay, I'm feeling this fear. Okay, so what does the fear feel like? What are the sensations associated with this fear? Tingling, buzzing, numbing, burning, whatever it is. Okay, once you identify that, what's the color surrounding us? So now we're getting super visceral with the process. Every time I do this work, not only on myself, I have it done with me, or I'm actually helping, empowering somebody through this process, it works every single time. Because once we get in touch with that, that's when we can really begin to understand not only the emotion that's tied to this, but the root of it. And the body and the mind are connected. So our unconscious and subconscious mind, which is basically, like we said before, creating our reality. Now, once we get into the body and we begin to work in sync and coherence with the mind in that process, as well as the inner child, which we can talk about, then that's when the layers begin to fall off and you feel clearer and lighter as you go through this process. But that's just the first step. But that's, talking about somatics and the importance of it. Every time we go into healing, I find at least through the work that I do, that's by far the most powerful work we can do is through the body.
Yeah. It's so funny because the modality that you use is similar to something I had done on me at training camp for the soul. I realized in that moment, like, oh my God, I remember this, right? Like I remember being a kid. Now, as a kid, like I was probably 4 or 5, so the ego hadn't fully formed yet. And I remember that my brother came over, my older brother. He's 20 years older than me. And so he was cool guy, leather jacket still is, right? I rock Camaro, just like all the cool stuff, right? Super nice guy. So I remember that, he didn't come over a lot, right? So I wanted to be with him. My dad and him went to Burger King to get food, right? Like literally down the street. But I came out of the bathroom or something and I didn't know they had gone yet. And so I asked my mom, she said they had gone, and I started throwing a tantrum, right? And I started crying and I was throwing myself on the floor, and I remember ending up on the couch just back like this. And then at a certain point, I was cried out and I didn't get to go to Burger King. They came back eventually, but I didn't get what I wanted, but yet I was okay. And I had just come to terms with it. And it was like the memory of something that was so natural at that age, like the visceral memory of it, that it now becomes so foreign, and I think for a lot of us in the modern day world, you probably resonate with this, because we're moving so fast. Again, like we're never taught this. We know it at that early age, but we're never taught it again. So very similar to the clairsenses or any of these types of things. If we don't know about it, it really doesn't exist, through the quantum unified field, it doesn't exist for us, And so it's very interesting because this stuff is so natural and simple. And I think that's actually what makes it so complicated. At least for me, that's what made it so complicated, because I was so used to, I must put in a lot of effort to get desired result, right? From school and all these things. And what this process is all about is actually get your mind out of the way and let your body do what it's always known how to do. And I think that's the ultimate paradox.
Well, think about our society, right? How is our society formed? Our society is formed strictly from the left logical brain, which is all about a step-by-step structured process. So creativity in the right brain and imagination are actually beaten out of us at a super young age. When we go to school, the education system is strictly that. Build this structure so that you become a fucking essential work slave to the world. And that's what it's for. And so these processes of actually tapping into our emotions and our feelings is extremely foreign until we start doing it. And not to mention when we're kids, right? As a dad, I have a 3.5-year-old son who I see all of the time go through these emotional processes. And fortunately, I've learned enough to be able to understand how to hold space for him as he goes through this. But kids, naturally, what do? a tantrum, right, is an expression of energy. But most times, 9 times out of 10, most parents are like, no, that's not acceptable. And so boom, more tantrums happen. No, that's not acceptable. Then it becomes a punishment. And so how does the shadow form is exactly from this. How do our core wounds form is from this. A kid's natural expression is through all emotions. I see my son get angry. I see him get sad. And now I'm helping him to identify these emotions. So he becomes emotionally intelligent and then is able to be like, oh, I was feeling this way, because a 3.5-year-old cannot regulate themselves. They don't have the actual frontal cortex or any of these other parts of their brain that are fully developed to actually emotionally regulate. So they need our help to do that. But the problem is most parents are fucking triggered by their children. And I've been triggered as well from different wounds I've had from my past. And they have a wounded child within that they don't know how to resolve. And therefore then they take that out on their children. And so then the cycle repeats, right? And so, I mean, there's so much rabbit holes here, because then you get into generational healing and all of that. But it's healing the self. And then again, how inner child work and wounded child work come into this is exactly, through what we were just talking about, through somatics as well. That all comes up.
Yeah. Cause like the core wounds are made in childhood, right? So why wouldn't you need to work with the inner child, and for anyone listening, like one of the easiest ways to understand this, because a lot of people I've worked with have this, is the too muchness. Like you feel like you're too much everywhere you go, right? Like you're afraid to fully express, and you might not even know what that really means yet, but like there might just be an intuitive feeling right now that like, I understand that, but I'm not exactly sure what it feels like, but like being afraid to speak up, being afraid to stand out, right? Any of these things are signs of potential core wounds that were exactly that. Hey, you can't express in that way.
Yep.
And why do they do that? Because they learned from their parents that was wrong to express. And so they're just, like you said, repeating that cycle, and it's very interesting stuff, because I find that with inner child healing, there's so much ability to break through these shadows and continue to live an amazing life after that. But again, it's such a foreign subject these days that I feel for most people, it's just like, wait, I'm going to get together with other people and cry. Like, what's this going to look like? And so I'd love for you, if you could outlay a little bit of how you work with people, but like, what would a typical session like this look like? Is there a typical session? Is there certain themes you see? Talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. And dude, everything you said is spot on. Like right now, and again, over the years through my own personal healing, I started to notice these patterns. Then, of course, working with people, I began to recognize certain behaviors and patterns that people repeat. And I also recognize that there's generally about 4 core wounds. And Sarah, my partner, she's a coach and incredibly talented, incredibly intuitive, incredibly tapped in. And she's been doing the same work, and we've been doing it together. And again, we've noticed these certain things. And so one of those, let me go over the core wounds first. Generally, you see at the core, and what is a core wound? This is an initial imprint that happens during childhood, right? And then there's fears that are built on top of that. It's like, elevators going down, right, into different floors until you get the wound. So generally there's like surface level fears, and then you drop down further, and then you get to the actual wound. What is it? Where did it happen? All of these things. And I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself, but the wounds: rejection, abandonment, guilt, and shame. So these are all very much, I can tell you how many times people come to me, they're dealing with a fear of rejection. And what are the patterns on top of that? People pleasing, right? Not being able to say no, not be able to understand what your boundaries are, all of these things, right? So you can see the symptoms of the core wound as they present themselves. So the mind-body methodology, somatic process that I take people through is, okay, like I said before, the first step, identifying where you feel these things. Where does we'll just use rejection for this whole thing. Where does rejection show up in you? Okay, let's just say in the heart space. Okay. What does rejection feel like when you're in a situation or an experience where you feel rejected, or where you're creating this pattern of people pleasing? Where does this show up for you? Where does it not feel good? It's in the heart. What's associated? What sensations do you feel while this is happening? What are the colors? Okay, great. So then we take it further. When did you start to feel these sensations. When was the first time you felt this pain in your heart? Well, I don't know, maybe around like 4 or 5 years old. Okay, great. We don't need an exact time. Okay, 4 or 5 years old. And then I take people into the environment. So we work with the breath too, and take them into the environment, imagining and then inviting in this part of themselves, this 4 or 5-year-old. What did they look like? What was their body language? What was their tone of voice? All of these things, and being able to really get them in and embody this part of themselves. Because what we want to do is we want to have this part speak into the council we've created. So if I have you, for example, I have you, and then maybe I have imagined a circle, and then the 4 or 5-year-old version of yourself sitting with us. And then we begin to understand, okay, what were my experiences then? What was happening within my household? Oh, my mom told me that I couldn't do this, or, I tried singing one time and my mom said, "Oh, don't do that. That sounds awful," or whatever it was. Yeah. A comment that to a child 0 to 7, you are in theta state. You are a sponge for everything in your environment. And so just those words alone, boom, there's an imprint. And then generally what happens is that imprint gets stronger and stronger because other people say things. And then this feeling of rejection just spirals and spirals and spirals. And so it's really, and it can take some time. Sometimes what happens in this process is that there's parts of us that come up. There's protector parts. There's resistor parts that begin to show up. So sometimes there's a barrier between this child and, the root in the core wound. So sometimes we have to work with other parts. I'm simplifying it right now. But basically, we get to that, we understand where it came from. And then what I generally do is I take people through a very powerful visualization process, because what is the desire on the other end of this? So what is the desire? It's to be and feel accepted. Okay. It's to, not have to live out these patterns, whatever. So creating more authenticity is speak my truth. So authenticity, acceptance, freedom, we'll just identify those core values. What do all 3 of those things feel like? Breathe those into your body. What are the sensations? Where do you feel that? And then we identify the colors associated with that, just like we did with their fear or whatever it was. And then we begin to dive into the essence of that and feel that into our bodies, as we also then use forgiveness as a tool to not only forgive ourselves and all parts of ourselves, but we use forgiveness to heal the family lineage all the way back. And I take people back to literally the beginning of time where the seed first was, where your mom, your dad, their parents, and everyone behind them, and bring a wave of forgiveness to them for all of the wounds they've experienced. Every time people go into a deep somatic experience where, sometimes they're shaking, letting out all of this stuff, it's a very powerful experience. And that's when the healing wave comes over them. And that's when they start to feel this lightness. Now, again, I simplify it. It can go many avenues, but that's generally the process in itself.
I love that, man. And, it is so powerful. I've been brought through these sessions before, and yeah, super uncomfortable for me at first, and again, I had a whole story when I first started doing it of oh, my ego is too cunning. This isn't going to work for me. All of these kind of things. And then I realized in that, oh my God, that's actually exactly what I'm going to try to figure out right now. It tricks you in such a cunning way. That's one of the things about the ego that I think a lot of people mistake, is that the ego is not dumb. It is way more involved in your life than you are consciously aware of. And I remember there was one mushroom experience where I met my ego face to face. And for many people who know me in person, I say game, recognize game a lot. And that's literally where I came up with that. Not that that's a saying I came up with, but when I started using it, it just came out of my mouth. I was laying in a yard in Austin at a retreat. Sunshine. It was beautiful. It was in December. So being in Boston, usually, I was excited to be in the sun, had a blanket over me, took like a 3-gram dose, nothing crazy. And I was laying there and I just saw this megalithic stone structure. It actually looked like a lot of the mountains we were driving by today, driving through San Diego to get to Arizona. And I just remember looking at it and having this mutual respect of like, okay, we know who each other are, right? And like my ego was like, are you going to work with me now? Like, because I could see what it was controlling. And it was so much more than just like these annoying things that I just wanted to get out of my life. Like, it was kind of like, hey man, I'm your dog. You programmed me, like I'm not the one to blame. It's kind of like how Blink-182 says, if we're fucked up, you're to blame, with the parents, and it's like, it was so true in that moment. And ever since then, I've had this newfound respect where I don't go to war with my ego anymore. I don't go to war with my shadow. I don't use these terminologies. Very similar to what Parts Work talks about. I see us all as one omniscient unit as a family.
Yes.
And I see myself as the father of that, my true self, my higher self. And it's up to me to be able to mediate, because no one's going to come save the day for me. I'm not a victim. So the only option is to bring loving awareness to this family unit of mine and be able to create harmony, and what I choose to believe is we sign up for certain lessons before we come down here. And so what's helped me a lot is just realizing that I choose to believe that everything I'm moving through is here to help me. And if that's the case, then that's a deep enough why to bear almost anyhow.
Boom.
Yeah. Well, dude, I wanted to ask you about something because, this is something we talked about chatting about on the podcast. And I'm super excited to dive into it because for everyone listening, I love cannabis, right? And I personally believe in my own experience that cannabis is the ultimate shadow work medicine. And I don't think a lot of people, maybe some people would agree, because what do we know about cannabis mostly? Oh, it makes me anxious or paranoid, which, spoiler alert, does not make you anything. You make you who and what you are. But that is a sign of the shadow, right? So 100%. I'm excited to bring this up. So I'm curious just what your thoughts are on this subject, just to start that, and then we'll dive in a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like both you and I can go deep on it. We already have. We've already talked about it because I think we did a video or we did a live at some point, I think perhaps. Yeah. And we talked about shadow work and cannabis. And that's why I'm really glad we're doing a longer podcast.
That will live forever somewhere.
That will live forever. Yeah. Exactly. Because, this is such an important part that people miss in the cannabis world or any psychedelic world, or in just the world in general, is how cannabis is such a special medicine. And ever since I started using it intentionally and, ceremonially was, I don't know, maybe back in 2017, 2018, I started to really tap into the plant in a new way. And I began to realize that all of the anxiety I may have experienced before, all of the fear I was experiencing when I had cannabis, perhaps it was like really shitty cannabis, but also, from the point of, cannabis is a teacher and it will bring those things up. And oftentimes people don't, when that happens, like, oh, I don't want to smoke that cannabis anymore.
Yeah.
But it's like, oh, well, I began to realize maybe I can get curious with this. Maybe this is here to show me something. And really going into it with that level of awareness to be like, okay, using it as a tool of inquiry. What does it want to show me? Even if it's uncomfortable. Well, as you always talk about, cannabis is a very somatic plant. It takes you into the body. And when you go into the body, that's when you start to begin to feel these certain fears and all of these things. So I don't strictly work with cannabis for shadow work all the time, but it is a phenomenal tool for bringing up the shadow and then working with it and then using it to heal.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been pivotal for me because like I said, I had all these stories about, oh, I can't, it won't work for me. And cannabis, it lowers the default mode network and ego. And so it allows me to get right into it. And, it's not that these plants give us anxiety or paranoia, but let's say, for instance, how does holotropic breath work or any breath work, right? Like it puts you into a certain nervous system state where all of a sudden the emotions associated with it just start coming up naturally, right? So with cannabis, when it has a sympathetic nervous system onset response and that heart rate starts increasing, it can bring up a lot of anxiety and paranoia and things that are alive in that state of being, right? And so I think that's a lot of how I see cannabis working, is that's why it doesn't give everyone these sensations and feelings, because some people might not have that in there, right? They might get their shadow brought up in a different way. Who knows how, right? But that's been very interesting for me, that just like clicked into place where it was like, oh, actually that's a whole nother layer to like kind of the more spiritual side of it, which is like, we understand it's a mirror. It only shows us ourselves, right? Like, but also on the more scientific end, it's like creating a physiological response in the body. And when it does that, there's going to be certain feelings, thoughts, sensations, emotions, memories, et cetera, that get triggered as a result. I think that's really cool too.
Absolutely, man. Like there's just so much to that. And again, I think why having this conversation is so important right now, as we talked about in the beginning, is that there's sort of this, looming collective shadow that I think people are feeling. And so what great opportunity to use tools like breath work, like cannabis, to really begin to understand and get curious about our shadow, and that's the thing I think you also said in the beginning is like, it's not about doom and gloom and all of these things. It's actually can be a really beautiful process when we begin to understand these parts of ourselves, and it makes way for even more magic and transformation to be had in your life. And there's so much there.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the collective shadow because, I think for a lot of people, they may be confused. Like, wait, collective shadow? What's my shadow then? Like, could you describe the difference between like a personal shadow and a collective shadow?
So a personal shadow would just be from your direct experiences, right? Things that you've experienced within your own life that then creates a personal shadow, right? For you. Now, everybody's experiences are different, so that may vary person to person. And then when we talk about the collective shadow, well, I mean, if we just go right into it, of course, everybody's sort of ideology is different, but I believe that we're all one, right? So from a soul standpoint, yes, we have individuated souls, but at the end of the day, we're all one interconnected web working together. And therefore your shadow, I can feel, and it's all connected to the collective shadow that's built into one shadow that we're all working on individually. And as we heal ourselves, that's why we begin to expand consciousness and heal the world. It all starts within. And so this is the way in which, we all need to be thinking about the shadow. It's not just personal, but collectively, this is really important work.
Yeah. It's so funny you mentioned that because I've had this, I don't know if I heard this somewhere, but I've had an idea for a little while that plants, I imagine, and I'm just guessing here, so that's why I'm using certain language, but I feel that they have a collective, almost consciousness as well, right?
100%.
And so I heard someone at some point say that the reason they thought, I mean, this is going to be obviously a very multifaceted statement I say, but they thought that one of the many reasons that LSD was so different was because it was only founded so long ago. And so the group consciousness of LSD, everyone that ever had an experience, was smaller than, say, like something like ayahuasca. So essentially, the older the thing, like cannabis or mushrooms or any of these things, the kind of like more depth they have to them. Have you ever heard anything like that? Or have you ever felt anything like that when you've interacted with these medicines or anything?
Well, I've actually never personally interacted with LSD, so I've actually never had an LSD.
I forgot about that, dude.
Yeah, I never had.
Kristen.
Perhaps it's the time.
Yes.
But just from a plant perspective, and just bringing that up. So one, I mean, when I say all is connected, we're all connected to the plants too.
Yeah.
Our nature, our elements that live within us are also external, the nature around us. So it's all connected. But then individually, if we take like just plants in general, each plant has its own soul in a way, its own expression. So the experiences that you're getting with cannabis and the type of energy that you're interacting with in cannabis is going to be totally different than ayahuasca, which I have experience with, and it's kicked my ass in many ways, but also shown me the light in the most powerful way. And so, these plants, they all have a way of working synergistically with us in our spirit and our DNA. And when we can bring, again, a level of awareness to that, we begin to see how this all ties together in such a powerful way.
100%. And one of the reasons I love cannabis so much, and of course, like I've benefited from many different medicines and I love them, but what I've found is that cannabis is just so practical. And it's also that because maybe you don't have as much shown to you at once, or maybe you do, depending on how deep you go, it's easier to integrate and you're still aware enough in your normal state of consciousness to be able to journal or take notes or these kind of things, where I don't believe everything in the experience is meant to be remembered. I mean, a lot of it's from the astral realm, which isn't necessarily trustworthy, but at the same time, there are some really powerful things that come through that can give you some really good context. And I think with cannabis, it's great because you have the option. I at this point know when I work with the plant, is this just an idea that like is just like mildly cool or mildly fun, or is this like, whoa, like revolutionary? Like last night I had a revolutionary session where I just channeled some stuff out about connect with cannabis, and I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. One of the things that I was unaware of, to make it personal, when I first interacted with psychedelics, is the fact that they're all in some way just lowering the default mode network and ego's presence, which then brings up the subconscious and the unconscious. And so it's an amazing opportunity, especially if you're like me, right? And you have all these stories of why in a sober state you couldn't heal, right? When I first started this work, it can be an amazing way to remember like, no, I can do this, right? But at the same time, it can definitely be very daunting to the inexperienced user. Like I remember when I was younger, everyone would talk about, hey, be careful, you might have a bad trip. Bad trips are literally shadow work. Like that's literally what it is. You
Precisely.
know, like literally, like it's so funny how now in the community, spiritual community and everything, I think people understand that a little bit more. I think a lot of people seek plant medicines out specifically for shadow work, but it was always funny back in the day, don't have a bad trip. And it was like, it's inevitable. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's actually like for me, yes, I've had incredible experiences and that have just been funny, but those are the ones that have changed my life, And again, it's just like if you want huge muscles, you're going to have to make a big commitment to the gym. Like the bigger the commitment, the bigger the potential payoff, not to incentivize large doses of psychedelics, right? But I'm just saying that for someone, it could just be a half gram, right? It doesn't need to necessarily be the amount, but it's the commitment to the process. I think that can bring it out a lot.
And just to go along with that, the bigger the vision, the bigger the challenges. You have a bigger vision for your life, the more challenges you're going to face to test you, to test your resilience, your spirit. How deep are you invested in this? And so again, back to what you said about cannabis, which I mean, for me, if anybody asks me, cannabis is my favorite medicine. Yeah. I love it. And, I love working with it. It works well with my spirit. And it works well with me in a way that none other medicines that I've worked with work with me in this way. And I love what you said as well is about the opportunity to integrate this because the valve is opened, and the image that came to my mind were these, when you walk through an automatic door at like a store or wherever, yes, and they just open, that's kind of what's happening. It's like you're walking towards the door and it just opens. And then again, the deeper parts of yourself begin to start to come through. That could be more creativity for me. That's often inspiration, getting things down. And then there's other times where, it's things coming up that's like, oh yeah, well, you've seen this in your sober life, but now let's bring it up so you can feel it a little bit more. And here's an opportunity for you right now. And then I can say, okay, I'm down, or no, I'm good right now.
Yeah. And it's funny because like before I knew this stuff, had plenty of very challenging experiences, hyperventilating, passing out, these kind of things that are happening. And definitely looking back, I was so grateful that I was around close friends, because even though the setting wasn't the best, a lot of the times when I had these situations happen, at least I had good friends present. But for people out there that are listening, like, what are some of maybe your personal practices or ones you pass on to your clients of things that, like, let's say when you're doing shadow work with or without plant medicines, right? Like, what are some of the things that if someone wants to try this on their own, right? They want to try out the exercise that you demonstrated here. Like, what are some things that you would recommend to them if and when the experience gets challenging? Like, what are some things you do?
First off, I like what you said the other night. We were somewhere and someone mentioned something about like having a quote unquote bad experience. I don't really like to use good or bad because it's very subjective, but if I have a bad experience, okay, I just took the medicine, medicine
is working
and the medicine is working. I love that, but other than that, it's like, breathing into the experience, the breath. And again, this could be another avenue to explore why breath and cannabis go so well together. And of course, why we're doing Breathe with Cannabis workshops, not strictly for shadow work, but that's a part of it. The breath is such a powerful tool for everything. I mean, it's the foundation of it all. And I mean, we've already talked and did a podcast on breathwork, so I won't get into it. Don't tempt me.
Guilty as charged.
But regardless, when we're having a tough experience, inviting the breath into it, and I always tell people, just talking about breathwork in general, we breathe over 20,000 times per day. And, this is actually a huge part of it. most of us that have experienced and endured some level of trauma, we are shallow breathers. We're holding our breaths a lot. We're breathing from the chest. We're not breathing deep. And just taking 5 to 10 deep conscious breaths, what does that do? People always, oh, I feel so good. I just needed that, just those few deep breaths. And so when you're in the midst of an experience, just those few breaths can really bring you back to center and bring you back into, okay, I'm here, I'm breathing, I'm alive, I'm going through this experience, and just being in that space. But then if you want to go deeper, using the breath as a tool to go deeper, because the breath will naturally elevate and take you into that space if you want to go there.
I don't know if it was that book that you recommended me, The Law of Light, which is amazing. If you guys get a chance to read it, it is amazing. But somewhere recently I was reading that someone synonymized breath with light. Remember how we were talking about love and light earlier? And I just got this really interesting picture in my mind about the whole idea of breath work, right? Holotropic breath work, for instance, the most well-known for shadow work, trauma release type stuff, right? And what we talked about earlier about how light is like light hitting a dark room, right? So a lot of people think love and light, it's all sunshine and rainbows, right? But it's actually a pretty violent masculine part of the process of yin and yang, right? So I just got this interesting picture of breath being the light. And the more breath you put into something, the more ability to bring up shadow work. Now, when you start combining medicines that also bring down the ego, your only defense system, which the breath will do, but it takes maybe longer. Sometimes maybe it works better, doesn't work better sometimes. When you start involving these medicines, no wonder this is happening. I mean, it makes perfect sense.
Dude, it's amazing. And this technology together, as we've talked about and why we created Breathe with Cannabis, is the power that's together in these medicines and this technology and these practices. It's the opportunities that are there are so powerful for healing. And that's why I'm so excited to keep spreading this with you and doing this, because it's incredible. And I love what you said there, because you are exactly right. I always explain to people, the breath is, because what are you doing? You're oxygenating your system. You're breathing in this air, and the deeper you breathe, the more these layers begin to peel back, right? We switch from a fight or flight, sympathetic response, depending upon the breath work we're doing. If we're doing, slower, deeper inhales like this, we're moving from sympathetic to parasympathetic. So we're opening our nervous system. We're dropping into a relaxed state. What happens when we're in a relaxed state? Our mind begins to open, and the breath is almost like, one of those things. It is a spotlight, and it will go right to those places. And I always tell people, it's like its own consciousness, just as the plant is, your breath is its own consciousness, and it will take you to the places exactly where you need to go without fail.
Absolutely. I mean, I was reading, it might have been the same book, but they were also synonymizing consciousness with breath, right? Exactly like you were saying. And so, yeah, it makes sense. If you're adding consciousness to your body, it's going to go fill in wherever the cracks are, And so where those cracks are ultimately where the light needs to go in, right? And light up whatever's in there. And so it's very interesting, man. And it's amazing, like you said earlier, that we're talking about this, because I think that for anyone who listened to episode 100 of this podcast, that Robert and I talked a lot about the potential for what psychedelics could become, or, what they're currently becoming. And I think that it's so important when something is demonized for so long and then made so popular that even the mainstream is talking about it. It's important to understand the frameworks from which that foundation can lay on, because if not, you're not going to have a foundation, and then people are going to have really challenging experiences. And I think that it's just a misinterpretation of actually one of the greatest gifts that these medicines, including our breath, right, and sober state of reality, have to offer us, which is the ability to stop suffering and start just feeling it to heal it, because, when I first started doing this work, it was fascinating to me, because I realized the ridiculousness of the program that had been running in me, which was it was almost unconscious. I would feel the uncomfortable feeling and feel the thoughts of it, resisting the uncomfortable feeling for 10 years, that was able to be fully felt in an hour. And then it was gone.
Isn't it funny how we do that?
It's crazy, and if how we do anything is how we do everything, it made me realize where else am I doing that in my life? You know what I mean? And that led to a lot of awareness and a lot of healing. And so Like I love to give, like we've been giving these real examples, because I think for a lot of people, like I know for me, sometimes when I listen to podcasts that are super science heavy, right? And people aren't talking about personal experiences, it can get challenging for me to contextualize it into my own life, And so I'm curious for you, like, what have been some of your other experiences of you working with your shadow, and however you want to take this, but some of the things I was thinking is like, how did it look for you? What were some of the signs that you were feeling in your life that maybe someone listening to go, oh my God, I'm feeling something that makes me want to look within?
Yeah, I'd love to. And as you know, and as we talked about, like I'm my intention with everything I do is to be authentic and vulnerable as I possibly can be, because that's really where true connection lies. And like at this point, like I'm not fucking here to hide anything. Like I'm a fucking human, just like all of us. Like just because I'm a space holder and I help people and I empower people, I still go through my own stuff, but now I have the tools and resources to be able to understand how to work with this instead of just like suppressing it and just letting it go. For me personally, like I really like, just to go back to just a couple days ago, actually even in this moment, some things that are left unresolved within myself. So let's say a couple of weeks ago, I began to notice what I felt was a pattern that was somewhat cleared, kind of started to show up again. And this is very common. I think this is a really important point to make, is that sometimes there's layers to the game, right? When we go in to do this work, we can heal a really big layer and that will clear a lot of energy for us. Like you're essentially liberated energy. But then what can happen is it will begin, because it's a fractal, it can show itself in different ways. So even a couple of years later, you could notice something very similar happening, but from maybe another viewpoint. And, one thing that was coming up for me is I started to notice where I was still attempting to seek validation in my life. And specifically when it came to social media, I'll just give that as an example. I'm feeling like my soul is writing such beautiful content and I'm like doing this, but then I realize, I'm not getting that many likes on this post or that many views. And maybe you can relate to this and people listening to this, but I realize I'm like, oh fuck, there's still a wounded boy in there that is seeking validation from others to ensure that he's worthy. Who gives a fuck if one person liked my post or it was a fucking 1,000 people? Someone needed to see it and the right people did. And obviously I know that in my conscious mind, but there was a wounded boy that was still like, not feeling good enough. And so this is a huge experience I've been having. So then of course we come here, you just did a podcast with Mary. I had a really powerful experience where she really brought through some things that I already knew, but were very much still alive within me. And what is currently holding me back from the next level of my expression. And that was some unresolved childhood wounds around anger, and the anger that I'm projecting not only mostly towards myself. And so there's this big opportunity that's presented itself. And you've noticed my hip has been in deep pain. I've never had hip pain like this before. And so here we go back to somatics. I go into one of my favorite books, The Secret Language of the Body. What is the hip? And the hip is generally when there's pain there. And I just want to preface this. Our pain in our bodies, we can trace it back to an emotion. And the emotion, that's where we heal from. The pain is a symptom of that emotion. And so what was the hip? It was family problems, disagreements, feeling unsatisfied, feeling unseen, all of these things. I'm like, oh, yep, check, 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 check. And I was like, holy shit, like, no wonder after this experience with Mary, and then all of a sudden my body began to express itself. Oh yeah, here's where you've been carrying it, but you haven't been feeling it. Now you are. So now I'm still going through this process, right? This is a deep one. I can feel on the other side of this. This might be a longer term process for me for a little while to kind of like get to the layers, but I know that on the other side of this is a incredible next version of myself. And I'm excited to see what that looks like, but I'm also, it brings up a lot. And so I'm in the middle of this process right now, but I'm also enjoying it. One of the greatest gifts that we can bring to this healing journey, and something why I love you so much and the work that we do together, is because there's humor brought into the space. And it's not from a point of bypassing. It's from a point of, hey, okay, I'm going through this. fucking weird reality am I in, first of all, like this, but also
I have a body.
appreciating this experience and yeah, bringing lightheartedness to it as well, which I think is often missed. And I think for a long time I took way too seriously when we can really understand how to work with humor in this way as a medicine as well for healing.
Yeah.
Feeling it, using humor and all these other things.
Yeah. When you started talking, you were talking about how, like, guys, just because I do this doesn't mean that I'm not going through it too. The analogy that came to me was this: the mechanic's car still breaks, but the difference is the mechanic is confident he can fix it, you know? And that's the difference, I think, as when you get into this work. And even if you just do it enough, or if you're a facilitator getting it done enough on you, is it still sucks. Like it's never like, oh, great, let me go face my worst fears, right? But over time, you're like, okay, this is going to be really good. Like, just like you were saying, you know, and very similar to you, I had a very powerful experience with Mary as well. If you guys get the chance to work with Mary, definitely do it.
Big shout out to Mary.
Holy cow. She is extremely magical. But, you know, I had a big experience that was finalized today during my Kabbalah study group. So basically, I became aware, she was helping me channeling. I became aware of this pattern on my father's side where my dad, all growing up, amazing guy, very assertive and confident and disciplined with himself, but with other people, he was more compassionate and caring and a little bit people pleasing and, you know, hard to say no. And so like people would come to him a lot in challenges and he would lend them money and they would screw him over left and right. Right. And I saw this growing up, but I never took it in. Like it all just came back to me the other day when I talked to Mary. And so I saw this and I realized this is part of a whole story that I knew I was in. I knew I was in a story, but I just didn't know where it started. I was in this story surrounding like, you know, and it's been since a kid, right? Mary called it out on me right away that it happened when I was 13 because I had a small bullying incident when I was 13 where like I had lost some of my power. It also happened when I was 9 and I got accused of cheating on a test that I wasn't cheating on. And in that moment, I didn't know how to stand up for myself. And I formed a belief that now I don't know how to stand up for myself, all of these things, right? And throughout most of my life, my height, you know, allowed me to just kind of like, you know, not get messed with mostly, but I always felt this feeling within. And so like her saying it, it clicked it in perfectly. I saw the actual, like she describes, like the texture of that part of the ego that was literally right here. And it was, again, doing the best it thought it could, but it was leading me into all these just like feelings of disempowerment, stories, all of these things. This is why a year ago I got into Muay Thai, but it still didn't get fixed. And I was like, okay, it's not about violence or like, you know, like defending myself. It's like something deeper. And it's gotten into, you know, again, it's been coming up a lot in the business and like, it's just been getting flushed out. And so today in Kabbalah, they were talking about these two Sephiroth, you know, Geburah and Hesed, and their polarities of each other. So Geburah is exactly what I was saying, assertive, establishing clear boundaries, all of these things. Hesed, on the other hand, is like super compassionate, loving, inclusive, you know, all of these kind of things. And what I realized was that, oh my God, I'm just like my dad. I am outwardly expressing Hesed, right? Very compassionate, loving. Sometimes I overgive, these kind of things. But with myself, I am fully Geburah. Like there's no excuses. I'm self-critical, all of these things, right? And I realized the pattern. And the second I realized it, which is the greatest part, again, like you were saying, I might not have solved it yet. I have no idea if that's even a thing that I'm supposed to solve or that if there's anything to fix. But now I'm aware of it. And when I'm aware of it now at least I can catch it, right? It's almost like when you first start meditating and at first you're just like, I suck at this, right? I'm not doing anything. But over time, you understand what silence in the mind is and you understand when the thought comes in and you know you can go back to the center point. That's like what's been opening up in me the last couple of days. And it's just been unbelievable. So I'm so glad we're sharing these because they both got kickstarted with Mary. Shout out again to Mary.
Yeah. And, you know, like, I mean, that's a beautiful experience. And I'm glad that you shared that because, yeah, in what you said at the last part, it's about awareness. This isn't about, and I always say this to people too, is like healing is not about fixing or changing or any of these things or solving. We're not broken. We have these parts of ourselves that have been repressed and suppressed. And so what we do is when we bring them up into the light, we then integrate them into the whole of who we are. We are naturally whole. Mm-hmm. right? We are wholeness. And so when we begin to understand that, then we begin to understand that, again, we are not broken. We are just have these parts of ourselves that are kind of scattered, and we're just gathering them and bringing them back together. It's like puzzle pieces being put back together. And as we do that layer by layer, we begin to recognize more of our truth, more of our true self, more of who we are beyond the limitations. And that's the gift, because what happens when you are more free as a result of all of that? You are deeply in your power. You stand and walk with purpose. You are confident. All of these beautiful things that are a result of doing this work. And who doesn't want all of those things, right? We want to live more meaningful, more purposeful lives. And that's what we get on the other end of that. And that's what I want. So
hell yeah, I'll take nail in the head for 500. And you know what the best part is that, like, for me, and I imagine most of us listening to this podcast, and I know I'm probably you, Shlomo, like, it's like we all grew up watching tales of like Indiana Jones and all of these people that like were the heroes, right? Luke Skywalker. Well, we all have the ability to be the hero, not just for ourselves, but for our entire lineage. Because if we choose to do the work in our lifetime, Bruce Lipton has proven that it goes back 7 generations and potentially forward 7 generations too. So it's like we get to be the hero of our own story in so many different ways, but especially like that's something, because I know for me sometimes, especially with my Geberra stuff, right? Like I can make everything into like a job, right? Like Rachel would say, I think it's Saturn in my 5th house. She's like, we take creativity and fun way too seriously, right? But it's important to remember like the payoff of this, that like this can be fucking fun. And that's why the lightheartedness and stuff is so important, because Mary pointed this out, because my dad was a master of this. He's the one who taught me it. There is bypassing, right? There's like, if someone's crying, you're like, oh, like just relax or whatever. And you try to make a joke to like, manipulate them or whatever, probably from the best of intentions. But then there's like calculated joy, right? Which is like you watch someone go through their experience and you empathize with them to the point where you can tell where they're ready to hear the thing that boom, snaps them right back, right? And that's, I think, what joy and love and all of these things are. Like for everything, there's a perfect time and place. If we notice that we have a shadow of something and we try to rush through it, well, it's just like the kid getting rushed through his tantrum or whatever, right? Like we don't learn to trust ourselves by doing the same things that we're looking to heal,
Precisely.
We do it by living into a different reality and a different pattern. And that can be really scary. But when we hear other people talking about this stuff and we realize we're not alone in this, and we realize that everyone is dealing with this in some way, shape, or form, yes, it looks wildly different, but yet our challenges are what connect us at the core level, no matter what color skin we are, age, etc. We're all here to be human beings, color outside the lines, be messy. And that's actually what can unite us, And I think that's why shadow work, very similar to like, if you go to the gym once, you're like, this is fucking ridiculous. I'm never doing this again to myself. But then 3 years into it, you're like, oh my God, I can't wait to get there and get on the bench press or whatever your thing is, right?
Yep.
And so it's very similar to shadow work. Like, this can become very exciting work. Like it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. And I think that's a lot of what we're bringing to Breathe with Cannabis is like, guys, this can be, yes, like allow it to be whatever it is, but it doesn't have to be a certain way. You can open up that full color wheel and allow it to be everything from complete ecstasy to complete agony, and potentially both of those in a 3-second span, right? Leave yourself open to everything, right? Like we're here for one incarnation in this meat suit anyway. Like I want to taste all the flavors of ice cream. No matter how much I know that I love Oreo, I'm still going to try a new flavor. And that's like, I think what's great about shadow work and life and all of this stuff. It just really, it has the opportunity to give you more life.
I absolutely love that. I absolutely love that. And I think, when we go back to just the psychedelic conversation and tie this all together now, with the psychedelics too, and this is, I know both you and I are huge on this, is integrating your experience, because how many times do we use psychedelics as this opportunity to keep going in, but we're not actually doing anything with it. And so how can we begin to use psychedelics as this place of integrating, if we did have a quote unquote bad trip or we had a shadow reveal, how are we working with this in our daily life? How is this then showing up, outside of this experience? Because many people just have the experience and then, oh, boom, it's over. I go on.
next ceremony next weekend. Let's go.
Exactly. But there's these, especially the more powerful medicines when you're talking about ayahuasca and things like that, like, fuck, man. I've done it 4 times. I've worked with the medicine 4 times and I've had vastly different experiences each time. But holy shit, like one experience took me a fucking dude, shit was coming up like 2 years later.
Yeah.
They say like the medicine stays within you for like a year, and perhaps longer. And so perhaps forever, it's integrated into your cells. So it's like, holy shit, like, it's really taking the time to work with these in a proper way, and I mean, there's a whole nother conversation about this, and I'm sure you've had it on many podcasts considering this is a psychedelic podcast. So I won't get into it, but yeah, there's a lot there that I think that should be mentioned.
Yeah, and I think that if how we do anything is how we do everything, which is definitely what is true for me and what has been a great teacher for me, then why would we expect any different from people going from ceremony to ceremony? Because we've been trained more is better, go fast, like produce, left brain, right?
Yep.
So like, therefore we go, well, if ayahuasca can help me heal, then if I do more ayahuasca, I get more healing. And they're saying healing gives more life. And like, so you can logic your way into a really uncomfortable situation, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you can put cookies in a microwave or you can put them in the oven where they belong, right? And at the end of the day, if you put them in the microwave, sure, you might get them in 2 minutes, but they're going to be disgusting and poisoned, right? So like if in the oven, right, like, yeah, it's going to take a little longer, take a little more patience, but the payoff is bigger. And I think that this is also a very important thing because, what I've seen is in the psychedelic movement, I've seen a lot of people doing the best they possibly can with what they know or lack of knowing, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important in this very new landscape to speak about, not the right way, but a way that we've found that works for us, right? And if someone likes it, they can take it on. But by no means saying this is the only way or any of these things, but I think there are some universal things, right? Like good things do take time. And I think that's going to be one of the hardest parts for anyone in the modern day world, including myself, including you, including Shlomo, to really grasp, right? Like I know for me, I'm an Aries dude. So like, I mean, dude, it is ridiculous, right? So like
I'm a Capricorn. I get it too.
Yeah, exactly. So like, I speak from experience when I say that, I don't regret anything I've done, right? But I know that now when I calculate and I have a lot of stuff to bring to the table when I go into a psychedelic experience, I get a much bigger payoff. I understand how to integrate. And it's kind of just like this, like, if you want to go hiking, you might do your first hike with a friend who's experienced and you're like, oh man, you have all these cool tools and all this stuff. I don't even know what any of this stuff is, right? And then you go up the first time, you're like, this was hell. And then you start realizing what all those tools actually do. And eventually, if you keep doing it, you're going to want to get your own toolkit and everything, right? And so hopefully this podcast has allowed people to put maybe 1 or 2 new tools in that toolkit, right? Something to try out because I think it's important. We can't expect the clinical approach to be the way that everyone wants to take. I've never taken that way. And personally, I'd much rather do mushrooms in nature than in a clinical setting. Not saying that's not valuable, but I think there's a lot of people out there who are going to be very similar. And I think it's important to understand, like, if you are going to do this yourself, right? Because people have been doing this with either the aid of a shaman or even themselves for thousands of years. If you're going to do that, rather than try to say, don't do it, because that's never going to work. Prohibition's never worked. Why don't we just say, if you're going to do it, take these things with you and you'll have a much better time. It's like, why not?
100%, and I think when we're in integrity with the medicine, whatever that medicine is, and with ourselves, like we can really enjoy the journey of this. Like, and that's what I think you were talking about a little bit and alluding to. It's like so much of our society, all of our society is towards the destination. But what the fuck we running towards? A dream, a goal in the future, which is fine. I mean, I'm guilty as charged.
Yeah. Yes.
I had to throw it back.
Yeah. Hell yeah. Game recognized game.
We have these destinations and all of these things, but it's enjoying the process and the journey and being present with what is in that moment, and easier said than done. This is a practice. It's mindfulness, but this is where the magic is because we really don't know when our last breath is going to be. And so why don't we really enjoy our journey and really take it in, and I think whatever you do, like if you take that approach, the shadow work, the light work, all of it, it all becomes fun in a way. Knowing that I'm molding into this higher, more refined, mastered version of myself. And it's like, that's what I want, and so I'm going to enjoy that process. And I can then look back in 3 years or 4 years, 5 years, whatever, and be like, wow, like, holy shit, like I did a lot there, and you really begin to recognize how grateful you are for all of these processes in this journey itself. So
yeah, and it teaches you like how to actually remember how to feel grateful, how to feel love. Like your experience of life deepens, and I think Larry Enticer said it best when he was like, just full send this motherfucker, like literally like no matter if you do it sober, altered states, whatever it is, like just the varying flavors of ice cream is what makes up this life. And I think that for a lot of us, especially everyone listening to this podcast, because you definitely didn't listen to this for something mainstream, right? Like, we're all breaking molds, whether like I don't imagine most of us are like, we're going to go break all the molds. It's just like, at least for me, and I imagine for you and many people listening, like it's just real life, the way they portrayed it always felt kind of weird to me. And I was just like, I'm not doing this. And being a 5-1, the 5 is literally like, you're here to make life more efficient for other people. And so like, looking around, I was like, this isn't how I want to live my life. Right. So I think a lot of people are feeling that way. Right. And so like, go into that, because if you want to get more out of life, that's what's going to allow you to experience different flavors of ice cream instead of just vanilla. Nothing against vanilla, right? I still love a vanilla ice cream every once in a while, raw dairy, of course. But at the same time, it's important to realize that every once in a while, dude, variety is the spice of life, And so like all of these experiences, every experience we have allows us to be more colorful, And I think that 100%, like you were saying, man, like that is 100% my goal in life. I will take nail in the head for 500, please.
Sign me up.
Hell yeah.
And again, just to that point, it's for me anyways. And I know for you, like all of the experiences I've had, all of the things, and I close my eyes and just envision it all. Like it all took me saying just, yes, fuck it. Like, why not? I'm not going to live the status quo. I want to trailblaze my own path and carve it out and see where it takes me. It's fucking scary at times, but you know what? I wouldn't have it any other way.
Absolutely. It's so much fun, and for everyone listening, like this is one of the things that I did a while back, and I actually am due for one of these again, but for anyone that's like curious about how to make yourself really feel what's possible behind whatever undesirable sensations or states of mind or everything you're living in, write a list out of your fears and then write out what the opposite of that fear is, right? Like what is possible if that fear didn't exist. And through that, create a story, what I call a manifesto. We do this in Connect with Cannabis. And you can choose to interact with cannabis and really heighten the feeling in your body if you want to. But regardless, write this manifesto out. And that becomes your why. And that you're going to recite to yourself every morning and night. And that will remind you when the going gets rough, why you're doing it, right? It's like for the person that wants a 6-pack, it's why they have someone with a 6-pack as a poster. So when they're at the gym and they're like, why am I doing this at 4 a.m? They look at the picture and they're like, oh yeah. Or they have their picture of their kids there and they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to be around for them later on. It's like, if you have a deep enough why, you can bear almost anyhow. And I think that, at least for me, has been the foundation of how I've been able to keep going. Because most of the time, because I still have quite a few of these programs running, the first thought is, I don't want to do this. I don't want to get up. I don't want to meditate. I don't want to. And it's that part of me knowing that it's its last stand, because at this point, I've shown to myself that I'm committed, and no matter if I want to or not, I'm going to get up and do it. And I think that like that's really helped me have faith that no matter what I come up against, I'm going to push through it. And that allows the shadow work to be simpler, like I was saying before. And that's been the foundation for me.
I love it, man. Yeah. What a great conversation. And I think extremely important at this time. I think why we did this in the first place, because like people are interested in this stuff, man. And, like there's not a lot of resources out there yet. I think there's some stuff, but you also still find a lot of bullshit. Like I just want to get real and get right to the point. And it's like at the end of the day, if we summarize everything, like this work is so accessible and approachable. And yes, it definitely helps to work with somebody and have a trained and skilled practitioner to take you through these processes. But literally the first step to all of this is just get curious about how you feel. Like as simple as that. Like, how do I feel? Like I had a client the other day, and I'll just go through this real quick and we can close it out. But, she was saying to me, she said, she's very much in her mind and her left brain. So anytime a challenge comes up, she's like, oh, what do I think about this? What am I thinking about this? I'm like, okay, we need to reframe that. It's not what you think. start asking yourself, how do I feel? If you get triggered by your boyfriend or, your boyfriend or your work or whatever it is, like, okay, how am I feeling in this moment? What do I feel? And where do I feel it? Those 3 questions. How do I feel? What do I feel? And where do I feel it? Just start doing that. And that is the gateway into the deeper levels and layers. It's like going through this quest within yourself. That will begin the quest if you're ready for it. And you can ask that yourself in the middle of a medicine experience when you're having some things coming up. Ask those things and then tune into it, breathe into it, feel into it. And simply you can stay there. And then if you want deeper layers of help, you can obviously ask somebody else. But that is so incredibly important. And just even in our sober reality, I give this practice to every single client that I have, anybody that comes into my sphere. Pause for presence. And this is based on a Gene Keys practice called the triple flame, where you set your alarm 3 times a day, 12, 3, and 6 you can do. Pause for 3 minutes when the alarm goes off. If you're in the meeting or driving your car, obviously you can't. But if you're not, pause for 3 minutes, shut down your phone, shut off your computer, and just breathe for those 3 minutes. Because that then begins to tune us into the subtle body, into the somatic body. And that's where we can then begin to understand, oh, okay, I'm feeling these things. And you then begin to drop from the mind into the heart. And that's where really you begin to see the unraveling as well as the awakening happening in those moments. And you just do that for 30 days, just that practice. That alone will be a beautiful foundation for anybody. So I just want to keep it as practical and grounded as possible.
Dude, I love that, man. This episode has been absolutely amazing. I feel like I've learned a lot. I feel like hopefully for everyone listening, you guys have not only some new information, but practical tools you can go home with and actually try out and start doing this stuff yourself. It'll probably feel a little weird the first time, but at the end of the day, it's super fun. Chris, where can people find you? Where can they find out about all the things we're doing with Breathe with Cannabis, all the amazing work you're doing with your clients? Tell the people where they can find you, man.
Yeah, thanks, brother. Well, first of all, like Breathe with Cannabis, I just know, like, I'm so excited. I love this project and this collaboration.
Dude, it's so sick.
For all of that stuff, I mean, obviously they follow you on Instagram, me on Instagram at Christopher_August. And then my website, ChristopherAugust.co, not .com, ChristopherAugust.co. And on that website has all of I do one-on-one healing sessions with people where I take them through this process. And then I do longer term coaching work as well, where I do 3 to 6 months with people that want to go deep. One session, it depends on, what you're going through. Sometimes we can clear things in one session if it's pretty light, but oftentimes, sometimes these are deep seated things. So, 3 to 5 sessions definitely help, but then, or even longer term coaching where I bring in self-discovery, which is the foundation, visioning, values, passion, and purpose. And then what's in the way from you living your ultimate life? Those are the wounds. Then we go into the wounds, start to clear those, and then we get into implementation. Okay, now that the wounds are cleared, how do we begin to implement all of this newfound awareness into your life so you can begin to live a more purposeful, meaningful, and authentic life?
Dude.
So that's kind of the process. And I'm still refining, it's like it's a dance. But so that's people can find me there and, on Instagram as well.
Hell yeah, dude. I love that. Well, bro, this has been amazing. You know what we got to do to close it out? Karate hands.
Oh, I'm all up.
Hell yeah. Okay, guys, like I said, this episode was thought up in the moment as Chris and I were both moving through quite a bit of shadow in the time surrounding us being out west. And rather than try to hide from it, we decided to bring the light to it and discuss our experiences openly. Thank you guys so much for listening and supporting the show. And for anyone looking to get in touch with Chris, work with him, and benefit from the vast amount of knowledge he has surrounding the subject of shadow work and much more, check out the show notes for this episode, where I will be laying out all of the easiest ways to do so. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to riff with me, for being such an awesome soul who inspires me and shares my dream of empowering the world at large, and for always being down to do a late night epic podcast bash. And until next time, my brother, may your journey be smooth and full of light. Aho.